It is Trumponomics time. Effects on euro, dollar and stocks. US rates, one step higher in December, and then oil price, where the bearish case could be wrong.
Can he make America great again? The really clever thing about Trumponomics is that it's Europe and Japan who pay to rebuild America and even potentially to get Donald Trump re-elected. That's because of all the cheap money that's being printed. And Donald Trump and his advisors are well aware of this.
I am the guy pushing $1 trillion infrastructure plan. With negative interest rates throughout the world, it is the greatest opportunity to rebuild everything. So Steve Bannon, chief strategist and senior counselor to the president-elect in an interview.
And they'll be right. Japan and Europe have got negative short-term interest rates. They're buying bonds in order to stimulate their own economies. But because credit demand is so weak, much of that money is going to spill out into the US. In effect, the large current account surpluses in the Eurozone and Japan are going to be recycled into rebuilding America's crumbling infrastructure, into tax cuts in the US, into boosting real wages and boosting jobs for the people who elected Donald Trump. Donald Trump's tax cut and spending plans are 1.5 times as large as Ronald Reagan's. And look where the dollar went during the Reagan years. If the same thing or similar happened, and that's adjusted for inflation, then this time the dollar could strengthen more than another 20%. What effect will Trumponomics have on Fed policy? Well, even before the election, Janet Yellen and her Fed colleagues were moving in the opposite direction from what's going on in Frankfurt under Mr. Draghi and what's going on in Tokyo. Janet Yellen's pretty well promised that the Fed will be raising rates in December. She's played down the pace of rate increases after that, but given the strength of the US economy already, and if you add Trumponomic tax cuts and spending on top of that, the Fed could end up going a lot faster. If we look at the bond market, we can see that bond yields have already taken on board a lot of this change environment. Bond yields have risen an astonishing amount. In the US, they're up something like 60 basis points, more than 0.5 percentage point since the election. And yields have risen all around the world as well. Maybe there'll be a pause for breath for a while, but I think the direction of yields is now clearly upwards. The last 2 years have seen Saudi Arabia and Russia increase production very sharply. Some people think that that means there's a glut of oil. But my view is that that actually has been a threat to keep other oil producers understanding that they've really now got to be more disciplined and cut back. And that's just what happened at last week's OPEC meeting. And as a result of that, the price has risen, now trading around mid-50s and with the potential even perhaps to go to $60. Well, there's been a lot going on affecting financial markets recently. Trumponomics, the European elections, and all that's resulted in quite big movements in the markets. So now let's ask the Werthstein Institute members their opinion about how the landscape is going to evolve in coming months. But please respect the 30-second time limit.
Okay, well, I'm quite concerned about the Trump policy environment. First of all, the policies he suggests have to go through the Congress. And of course, that's not assured they're going to stay in the form that he proposes them. And the debt ceiling expires in March. So I think that's a significant change looking ahead. I like the public investment, though. I think that's very positive, as long as it is done on projects which are going to be productive. But I think the OECD has already pointed to the world being in a low growth trap, and I think that's a significant downside risk everywhere.
Well, coming to politics, actually, in France, the Fillon surprise election really came as a kind of a reassuring moment for the market, but actually nothing is said yet. We still have to run several elections and primary election, and the real campaign will start later in the springs. So far, Madame Le Pen is still way ahead in opinion polls and a sure contender for the second round of the election.
In general, I agree with you, Giles, but I don't think that the Trumponomics will have these positive impacts as the Reaganomics had, because there are some serious differences. What you have to see is that Reagan also made a big tax reform, bringing down the highest income tax rate from 70 to 28%, and the former Fed president, Paul Volcker, set the interest rates up on 18% to bring down the inflation, and this lifted the dollar a lot. But in general, I agree with you. I think Trumponomics will have positive impacts.
Well, that brings the discussion to an end, and now it's time to go to the Werthstein Index. And just to remind you, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to vote between 1 and 10 to signal their view about the short-term direction of the global stock markets. And I'd like to begin by turning to Stefan.
As I said, I'm not as optimistic on the Trumponomics as Giles, because the other point you have to see is that the total debt when Reagan started was 150%. Now it's 290%, more than the double. On the other hand, you have to see that the interest rates, short-term and long-term, are so low that financing this debt is cheaper than in the 80s. And that's the point. I think equities with these high dividend yields still have a lot of gap to the bonds, what they can recover, and that's the reason, the undervaluation of the equities, that I'm still so optimistic, and I'm also, as Giles, on an 8.
I do disagree, actually. I think the tax proposals are really worrying, but I think the public investment is very positive. But overall, I think the OECD are right. The world is in a low growth track, and because of that, I'm very cautious, so I'm going for a 4.
Okay, well, against all odds, markets went up since last month, but it makes me even more cautious, especially before the Fed. So I'm maintaining my vote, and I'm still a 4.
So the markets have gone up, but I think that they can trend up further. And I like the fact that the bad news about the Fed in December is now known to everybody, so out of the way. Because of that, I'm voting an 8. Now, if we put that vote together with everyone else's, that gives us a total vote of 24, or an average of 6 per Institute member for the Werthstein Index this month. That's a modest improvement on last month, when the average was 5.5. Looking forward to seeing you all next month with all the new information.